Well, back here in Nigeria on Tuesday, President Muhammadu Buhari saw the consideration and approval of the Senate for the Finance Bill 2021. The president hinged his request on the fact that the Finance Bill 2021 seeks to support the implementation of the 2022 budget by proposing key reforms to specific taxation, customs, excise, fiscal, and other relevant laws. Well, we want to know more about this. We have Mr. Ayo Dijebo. He's the head retail investment at Chapel Hill Denham to explain the relevance of this 2021 finance bill and how it pertains to the budget and other related issues. Good to speak with you, Mr. Ebo. Good morning.
Good morning, and thanks for having me.
So let's help us to understand. Let's start from the scratch. Now, help us to understand this finance bill and what it offers Nigerians.
Okay, thank you. The finance bill is like a law that guides the tax and the duties that are being charged by the government. So for most governments, what they finance, the role it plays, it's the support in terms of revenue generation to bridge the revenue generation gap in the budget. So the budget that has been proposed, a part of it would have been premised on projected assumptions. So on a yearly basis, I think for Nigeria, this is the third year consecutively that we're introducing the Finance Act after submitting the budget. So it helps to, what we see is adjustments in taxes to either meet up to help increase revenue, and also when they are critical sectors, in line with the macroeconomic realities, we also see some adjustments. If they want to, if the government wants to support a particular sector, you see taxes being changed to favor that sector, and if they also feel that they need to increase revenue to support the budget, you will also see that increase. So, for instance, if you see in the last 2 years, it was the Finance Act that also put into law the increase in VAT. So I believe that this is commendable because before the last 3 years, the Finance Act that we're using was really stale, and it was really was not relevant to current reality. So by and large, it's a law that guides and helps to know what we should expect within the business environment.
Okay, so does it mean that there's supposed to be a finance bill or act every year to suit the budgets? Will there have to be an amendment every year to, suit the requirement in the business space or the government space?
Yeah, you are very correct. In other climes, it should be every year because it helps the government will look at the current reality and try to adjust, whether in favor or on the other hand, to see how they can support businesses, support critical sectors, as well as increase revenue. So it's always in line with the budget. So it's something that should be published every year so that most of our tax laws or most of our charges are relevant to current reality. So when you look at, for instance, last year we had COVID-19, which impacted on us. And part of what they are looking at this year, that virus exposed there's a law in the Finance Responsibility Act that says you can only borrow for capital expenditure. So now they are proposing a change that would reflect that you can borrow for any natural major impact, or what I would say, any major reforms in the economy that is required, and not just capital expenditure. So you can see that relevance, such that if there's any major shock on the Nigerian economy, they will be able to raise funds to support that particular task.
Okay, it's interesting that you brought up, the fact that the bill also will now make provision for borrowing for maybe natural disaster, and things like that to help cushion the effect. But what we see more is the issue of tax, and charges. And so it will come natural for Nigerians to say, is it possible to see maybe 2022 finance bill reduce the tax, or will it always, be on the high side? Is it possible to see it come down?
Yes, I think it's possible to see it come down. And one of the um, laws that have been proposed, that have been proposed in this in the 2021 Act, is like there's the reduction in minimum tax. So when you look at minimum tax is charged when company does not make a profit, and what they are proposing is to reduce it from 0.5% to 0.25%, so that your tax liability does not just continue to accumulate while you are not making profit. That also excludes franked investment. Investment are those are income that you earn from companies that you have invested in. And those income in terms of dividend have already been taxed by those companies before payment of dividend is being done. So it can be either ways. We saw even last year that for the SMEs, in terms of capping, excluding SMEs that have turnover, if I can still recall the figure, I think about 50 million and below, excluding them from paying tax. So what it does is government will look at the current macroeconomic environment, will also look at, based on their fiscal policy in terms of which sector do we want to drive, can we exempt, can we reduce their tax within that space. So it's not all the time that it leads to increase in tax, and it can be either ways.
So who contributes to this? Is it just the government? Is it just within the public sector? Does the private sector have input in this before it now goes for, assent and all that?
Yes, I believe that the government has been working closely with private sector, and their contribution would have also been sought. And I feel that also based on following due process, there would also have been like an open hearing where people would also make suggestions. So I know it's going to have involved both private sector and the public sector, because the most of the taxes also comes from the private sector. So there's a need to also hear from them before it's enacted, to know what impact it would have on them if it finally passed.
So based on some of the amendments, capital gain tax of 5% will be applicable on disposable of shares above 500 million naira. Could you expatiate on these proposed changes?
Okay, thanks. I would see this particular act like a progressive tax, so trying to tax the rich. So what it's simply saying is that if you sell proceed of your shares is up to 500 million and above, it will be subject to a tax of 5%. If you don't reinvest it in any Nigerian company within that year. So if you sell your shares today and you booked profits, and the value of the sales proceeds is above 500 million, it means that you're expected to remit 5% to the government. But if it's below 500 million, then you would not be paying tax. Also, part of what has been um, introduced within that particular act is that this excludes securities lending, and which also supports what the Nigerian exchange is also trying to do, to see how they can increase activity within the securities lending space. So for me, in my view, I believe that this would be positive. Would try to retain investment within the Nigerian space, because part of what that particular act is saying, that if you don't reinvest in Nigerian companies and maybe you decide to invest offshore, it means that you would pay tax on that. And if you are reinvesting just a part of it, you would also just pay tax to that based on the proportion of what you are not reinvesting. So by and large, it requires planning, and that's part of what it does. It requires planning to know when to when to sell, and when you are selling, to know the implication. And if you know that you will also be bearing like a 5% tax, you need to look at what's the ROI, that your return on investment on that particular stock that you are trying to sell. So it's really very interesting times, and it's good that a lot of people are aware, so that at the end of the day, you don't also make a loss on your investment.
Yeah, and I think it engages more minds when it comes to that space. Well, another interesting one is lottery and gaming business that may become taxable under this new act.
Okay, yes. That when you look at that sector, based on statistics, is the size is about $90 billion. And what government is looking at is that when you look about, based on the data, about 60 million Nigerians between the age of 15 and 40 years participate within that space, and their contribution to tax has been really very low. So now, seeing how that sector has grown significantly, they are also trying to see how they can sweat that sector in terms of getting uh, a part of the revenue or the income within that space. So I mentioned during the introduction that part of what government also looks at is they've seen that they need to bridge their reduce the budget deficit, or to meet a certain revenue target. So they look at sectors that are doing well and are not contributing significantly to to tax. So yes, for the populace, that would seem like, yes, there's an increase in what they will pay, or for the companies that are operating within that space, it will reduce their revenue within that particular amount. But I feel that government has allowed this particular sector to grow or stabilize to a development level, and taxing them now, I feel that there's really nothing wrong, though the tax rate has not been fixed, and that's is when we see that the rate, that we can also speak more on that particular act.
And we also see that FIRS will be empowered to assess company income tax on turnover of foreign digital companies. Will this not discourage new foreign companies who are planning to come into the Nigerian space?
Okay, thanks. Looking at this particular act, I think it's really a very complex one in terms of implementation. So based on my little understanding of what goes on within the telco sector, so they are trying to tax like companies that provide interconnect activities. They are not domiciled here in Nigeria, and how do you also determine how, in terms of revenue, are booked around when the calls move from one country to the other? So it's really going to be very complex to implement, and there will be need to provide a lot of clarity on how that should be done. So beyond just fixing a particular rate in terms of collecting company income tax, there needs to be clarity so that companies can prepare ahead. They can look at the implication on their business, look at the visibility and how it will impact, so that they know whether to engage in such activity or not, because the tax has implications. CITs are 30%. So if I have to bear about 30% of that income at the end of the day, is it worth going into that business? So that is a very technical and complex law that is being introduced, but there will be need to be maybe NCC and maybe the parastatals around guiding the digital space would also need to provide clarity or work with government within on this particular act.
Okay, so that also brings to mind the question of even before now, we talk about the mechanism available to collect tax, for federal and for state government. Now, with all of this that look, very impressive, especially, when you talk about the 5% of 500 million and all that, do we have both the personnel and the equipment, to follow through with this interesting amendments that have been brought to actually implement them, and so that we can see the benefits?
Okay, thanks. I think to a large extent, we've seen a bit of improvement in terms of digitalizing the collection of taxes. You see now that you can view, even for payee, you can view uh, what your company is paying, and you can easily get your tax clearance, and you can see the records. And also for companies, most it's also done digitally. Well, and in terms of follow-up, we know that, in Nigeria, the our major challenge is not policy formation, it's implementation. So I would say that for some of these policies, implementation is always a challenge, because beyond just making that adjustment in the Finance Act, there also needs to be clarity in terms of implementation, so that the tax professionals, the companies, they are aware, and they can prepare ahead. So if you just set something and just put a rate, or you are just including a particular sector in the tax net, then, and you are not providing clarity, there will be a lot of back and forth with tax professionals when they visit companies, and as a result, it discourages investment, because it can lead to double taxation for companies.
Exactly, exactly. Thank you so much, Mr. Ayodejebo. And like you said, interesting times for tax professionals and people in the finance space. But of course, it looks like the government also has a lot of work to do when it comes to enlightenment, to bring this to people's doorstep and get them ready for a new season in the 2021 Finance Act. Thank you so much and enjoy your weekend.
Oh, thanks, and thanks for having me.
So we'll take a break now. After the break, there's been a drop in the number of internet subscription now at a time when the world is going virtual. What could be the cause? Find out on Business Morning after the break.